There are places in every city where beauty is manufactured. Where dreams are built on angles and lighting, where perfection is the currency, and youth is the only acceptable form of payment. Miami's Design District was one of those places. In the early 2000s, it glittered with promise. Models walked its streets like living sculptures. Photographers captured moments that would sell everything from perfume to fantasy. And at the heart of it all stood Prestige Talent Agency, a temple to an industry that consumed as much as it created. But here's what most people don't understand about beauty. It has a shelf life. A countdown clock that starts ticking the moment someone decides you're worth looking at. And in an industry built on the temporary, on the fleeting nature of a perfect face or a perfect moment, there are those who cannot accept that clock. Those who refuse to let go. Those who will do anything to stop time itself. This is a story about obsession. About control taken to its most extreme conclusion. About a young woman whose face promised her everything, and about the man who decided that promise belonged to him alone. It's about 17 years of secrets kept in a locked room. About a truth so disturbing that when it was finally discovered, it would force an entire industry to confront what it had allowed to happen in plain sight. In June of 2003, Isabella Cruz was 21 years old. She had everything ahead of her. A face that cameras loved. A determination that set her apart from the hundreds of other young women who walked through agency doors hoping to be chosen. She was days away from her international debut, from the moment that would launch her into the stratosphere of high fashion. She had worked for this. Sacrificed for this. Believed in this. And then she vanished. The official story was simple. Too simple. The pressure became too much. She ran. She couldn't handle the demands of a career she'd fought so hard to build. It was a narrative the industry knew well, had seen before, and accepted without question. Another cautionary tale. Another young woman who couldn't survive the weight of her own potential. But Isabella Cruz didn't run. She didn't crack under pressure. She didn't abandon her family, her dreams, or her future. What happened to Isabella Cruz was far worse than anyone imagined. And for 17 years, the truth stood silent in a climate-controlled room, dressed in vintage couture, admired by those who called it art, protected by a man whose reputation made him untouchable. Victor Castellanos was a name that commanded respect in Miami's fashion world. He had built an empire from nothing. He had an eye that could spot potential in a crowded room. He had made careers, shaped faces into brands, turned unknown girls into household names. His word was law. His taste was impeccable. His methods were unquestioned. And his private obsessions, the ones he kept locked away in a room few were allowed to enter, went unexamined for nearly 2 decades. August 2020. The world was dealing with a pandemic that had changed everything. Victor Castellanos was dead, a victim of a virus that showed no mercy to age or accomplishment. His agency was being dismantled, its contents catalogued and sold off. The building that had once pulsed with ambition and desperation now stood empty, waiting for someone to box up its history and move on. That's when Marcus Thompson was called in to finish the job. He was a maintenance supervisor, a man who had spent 30 years taking care of buildings that other people used and abandoned. He had seen it all. Or so he thought. Because what Marcus found in that locked room on a Tuesday afternoon in August would shatter everything he thought he understood about the work he did, the building he maintained, and the man who had once controlled it all. What Marcus found was Isabella Cruz. Not a memory of her. Not a photograph or a sculpture or a tribute. Isabella herself. Preserved. Displayed. Kept like a possession for 17 years while the world moved on without her. While her family mourned. While the industry that had consumed her life forgot her name. This is the story of how a young woman's body became someone else's obsession. How art became evidence. How a locked door kept a secret that should have been impossible to hide. And how one accidental moment, one slip of the hand, one displaced wig, finally gave Isabella Cruz back her name. Some stories are about justice. Some are about revenge. Some are about closure. This story is about all of those things. But most of all, it's about remembering that beneath every image of perfection, every manufactured moment of beauty, every carefully controlled presentation of flawlessness, there is a person. A human being with a family, with dreams, with a life that matters. Isabella Cruz mattered. And this is her story. Before we continue with this investigation, I want to ask you something. Stories like this, stories that expose the truth hidden behind glamour and power, only reach people because you choose to listen. If you're finding value in this investigation, if you believe these stories need to be told, please subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support helps us continue bringing these hidden truths to light. Now, let's uncover what really happened in that locked room in Miami. Marcus Thompson had been working on the prestige talent agency building since 2005. 15 years of maintaining the space where dreams were manufactured and broken. He'd seen the parade of young faces coming through those doors, each one convinced they would be different, that they would be the one who made it. He'd watched some of them succeed. Most of them disappear. He'd emptied trash cans filled with discarded headshots. He'd cleaned floors where tears had fallen after brutal rejections. He'd been invisible in a world where being seen was everything. And through all those years, there was one room he could never enter without explicit permission from Victor Castellanos himself. The gallery. That's what Victor called it. A climate-controlled sanctuary at the far end of the building's top floor. Victor kept the only key, wore it on a chain around his neck like some medieval lord guarding his treasure. The few times Marcus had been allowed inside to perform maintenance, Victor had stood there the entire time, watching, making sure nothing was disturbed, nothing was touched beyond what was absolutely necessary. The room housed Victor's legendary collection of vintage couture. Gowns worn by starlets from Hollywood's golden age. Pieces from the great fashion houses of Paris and Milan. Each one preserved in archival garment bags, arranged with obsessive precision. The room was kept at exactly 62 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity was monitored constantly. Special filters cleaned the air. Victor treated that room like it was the Vatican and he was its only priest. But there was something else in that room. Something that had appeared in June of 2003, right after one of Victor's models had disappeared. A figure. A mannequin, everyone called it. Though calling it a mannequin felt inadequate the moment you saw it. This was something else entirely. Something that made you uncomfortable in ways you couldn't quite articulate. The figure stood in the center of the room on a raised platform, dressed in a vintage Versace gown from the 1990s. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. The face, the hands, the posture, everything about it radiated a realism that crossed the line from impressive into unsettling. Victor called it his tribute. His memorial to Isabella Cruz, the model who had vanished just as her career was about to explode onto the international stage. He said he'd commissioned it months before her disappearance, that it was meant to be a surprise, a way to capture her essence before the fashion world consumed and changed her. The timing seemed strange to some people. Commissioning a life-size sculpture of someone without their knowledge? Unveiling it just days after they disappeared? But Victor's reputation provided cover. He was eccentric. He was artistic. He was obsessive about his models, everyone knew that. This was just Victor being Victor. Intense. Controlling. Devoted to his vision. And the figure was undeniably beautiful. Hauntingly so. Fashion journalists wrote articles about it. Other designers and agents made pilgrimages to see it. It became one of those insider secrets of the Miami fashion world. If you were important enough, if Victor deemed you worthy, you might be invited to the gallery to see his masterwork. His frozen moment of perfection. Marcus had cleaned around that figure hundreds of times over the years. Every Monday morning, early, before anyone else arrived, he would unlock the gallery with the key Victor had grudgingly provided him, and he would spend exactly 30 minutes inside. Dust the shelves. Vacuum the carpet. Empty the small waste bin that was rarely used. And try not to look too closely at the figure in the center of the room. Because there was something about it that bothered him. Something he could never quite name. The eyes were too real. The skin had a texture that didn't match any material he'd ever seen on a mannequin. And there was a smell in that room. Faint but persistent. Chemical. Sharp. Slightly sweet. Victor said it was from the preservation treatments he used on the vintage leather pieces. Experimental techniques. Cutting-edge conservation methods. Marcus didn't know anything about fashion preservation, so he accepted the explanation. But the smell never went away. It clung to the back of his throat. It followed him out of the room. He learned to work quickly in the gallery. Get in, do the job, get out. Don't think too much about the figure watching him from its platform. Don't wonder why its gaze seemed to follow you around the room. Don't question why a man would want to spend hours alone with a sculpture of someone who had abandoned him. March 2020 brought the pandemic, and with it, Victor Castellanos' death. COVID-19 doesn't care about reputation or power or the empire you've built. Victor fell ill in early March. By the end of the month, he was gone. No family. No designated successor. No plan for what would happen to Prestige Talent Agency without the man whose name and vision had been its entire foundation. The agency tried to continue for a few months. But without Victor, without his eye, without his connections and his brutal judgment that everyone had relied on, it couldn't sustain itself. By July, bankruptcy papers were filed. By August, the building was being sold. Everything had to go. The furniture. The photography equipment. The archives of headshots dating back to 1995. The vintage couture collection. Everything. Marcus was hired to oversee the final clearance. Make sure everything of value was properly inventoried, packed, and removed. Make sure the space was left clean and empty for the new owners. It should have been straightforward. It should have been just another job. Clear out an office building. He'd done it dozens of times. But there was the gallery. The locked room that Victor had guarded so jealously. The room that now needed to be emptied like everything else. The estate liquidators had specific instructions. The vintage gowns were to be carefully packed and sent to auction houses in New York and Los Angeles. And the figure, the Isabella sculpture, was to be crated and transported to a climate-controlled storage facility. It was listed in Victor's estate documents as a valuable art piece. Insured for a substantial sum. It needed to be handled with extreme care. Marcus stood outside the gallery door on that Tuesday in August, the master key in his hand. It was the first time he'd been in that room since Victor's death 5 months earlier. The liquidators had been through every other part of the building, but they'd left the gallery for last. They needed someone who knew how to handle the space, who understood its importance. They needed Marcus. He unlocked the door and pushed it open. The rush of cold, chemical-scented air hit him immediately. Stronger than he remembered. Or maybe it was just that the room had been sealed for so long. The climate control system was still running, still maintaining that precise temperature Victor had insisted on. Still filtering the air. Still preserving whatever was inside. The room looked exactly as it always had. Racks of garment bags lining the walls. Soft lighting from carefully positioned fixtures. The plush carpet that muffled every footstep. And in the center, on its raised platform, the figure. Still wearing that Versace gown. Still standing in that perfect posture. still frozen in that moment of eternal youth. Marcus had brought the specialized packing materials the liquidators had ordered. A custom-built crate with padding designed to protect delicate sculptures during transport. Straps and supports to keep the figure stable. He'd been given detailed instructions on how to remove it from its base, how to position it in the crate, how to secure it for the journey to storage. He approached the platform slowly. Even after all these years, even knowing he'd been in this room hundreds of times, he felt that same uncomfortable tension he'd always felt around this figure. Up close, the realism was even more pronounced. The details of the face. The individual eyelashes. The subtle variations in skin tone. The way the hands were positioned, fingers slightly curved, as if they'd been caught in the middle of a gesture and frozen there. He found the release mechanisms at the base of the platform, hidden underneath, just where the liquidators had told him they'd be. Small latches that held the figure anchored to its stand. He knelt down, reached underneath, and carefully disengaged them one by one. The figure was now freestanding. Ready to be moved. Marcus stood, positioned himself, and placed his hands on the figure's waist and shoulders, bracing himself to lift. The liquidators had warned him it would be heavy. High-quality sculptures often were. But the moment he began to lift, he was surprised by just how heavy it was. Dense. Solid. Not at all like the hollow fiberglass or resin he'd expected. This had weight. Substantial, real weight. He adjusted his grip, bent his knees properly, and lifted the figure off its platform. 3 inches. 6 inches. He had it. He took a shuffling step backward toward the waiting crate. Then another step. His foot caught slightly on the edge of the carpet. Not a trip, just a small catch. But it was enough to throw off his balance for a second. The figure tilted in his arms. He tried to compensate, to keep it steady, but the weight was too much, the angle too awkward. The figure slipped from his grip. Not a crash. It didn't fall to the floor. But it landed heavily against the padded interior of the open crate, tilting at an angle. Marcus's heart was pounding. Had he damaged it? Had he broken this piece that was supposedly worth tens of thousands of dollars? He reached out to steady it, to right it, to check for any cracks or breaks. That's when he noticed the wig had shifted. The figure wore a dark wig, long and styled the way models wore their hair in the early 2000s. The impact with the crate had knocked it askew. Not off completely, but enough to reveal the hairline underneath. Enough to show what was beneath. Marcus reached out automatically to adjust it, to push it back into place. His fingers brushed against the exposed area just behind the figure's left ear. And he stopped. His hand froze in midair. His breath caught in his throat. Because what he felt wasn't silicone. Wasn't latex or resin or any synthetic material. What he felt was skin. Real skin. With texture. With pores. With the subtle give of flesh over bone. And then he saw it. Small. Pale. Crescent-shaped. A scar. A real scar, the kind left by an old injury, the kind that heals but never completely disappears. The kind of unique, individual mark that belongs to a specific person. Marcus pulled his hand back like he'd touched fire. His mind was racing, trying to process what he'd just felt, what he'd just seen. It couldn't be. It wasn't possible. This was a sculpture. A mannequin. A piece of art that had been here for 17 years. An object. Not a person. Never a person. But his hand had felt what it felt. And his eyes had seen what they'd seen. He forced himself to look closer. Really look, the way he'd avoided looking for all those years. He examined the face at close range. The skin wasn't painted. It had texture. Microscopic detail that no artist could replicate. He looked at the hands. The fingernails weren't sculpted or attached. They were growing from nail beds. They had cuticles. They had the slight ridges and variations that every human nail has. He looked at the hair where the wig had shifted. It wasn't implanted in a sculpted head. It was rooted. Growing from a scalp. The chemical smell. That persistent, sharp odor that had filled this room for 17 years. It wasn't leather preservation. It was something else. Something designed to preserve organic material. Something designed to stop decay. Marcus backed away from the crate, his legs shaking. He thought about every time he'd been in this room. Every Monday morning for 15 years. Standing a few feet away from this. From her. From Isabella Cruz. Not a memorial. Not a tribute. Not art. Isabella herself. Her actual body. Preserved through some process he couldn't begin to understand. Kept here. Displayed here. Dressed in couture and lit like a museum piece while her family mourned and the world forgot her name. Victor's obsession hadn't been about creating a perfect sculpture. It had been about keeping Isabella. Refusing to let her leave. Refusing to let her grow or change or become anything other than what he wanted her to be. Perfect. Young. Frozen. Marcus pulled out his cell phone with trembling hands. He'd seen a lot in 30 years of maintenance work. But nothing like this. Nothing that came close to this. He dialed 911, and when the operator answered, he said the words that would finally, after 17 years, bring Isabella Cruz home. He said, "This isn't a mannequin. This isn't art. This is a person. This is Isabella Cruz. And she's been here the whole time." To understand how this was possible, how a crime this extreme could hide in plain sight for 17 years, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to when Isabella Cruz was alive, vibrant, full of dreams that had nothing to do with becoming someone's possession. Back to 2003, when Miami's fashion scene was at its peak, and prestige talent agency was where every aspiring model wanted to be. Isabella Maria Cruz was born in 1982 in Little Havana. Her parents had come from Cuba a decade earlier, part of the wave of immigrants who built new lives in Miami. Her father worked construction. Her mother cleaned houses. They were not wealthy. They were not connected. But they worked hard, and they taught their daughters that in America, if you were determined enough, if you wanted it badly enough, you could build something from nothing. Isabella was the younger of two daughters. Maria, her older sister, was the practical one. Good at math, good at planning, good at seeing the realistic path forward. Isabella was the dreamer. The one who sketched fashion designs in her notebooks during class. The one who studied magazines like they were textbooks. The one who believed that beauty could be currency if you knew how to use it. She was tall for her age by the time she hit 13. Long-limbed and angular in a way that made her feel awkward at school dances but caught the eye of a fashion photographer at a mall in Coral Gables when she was 16. He gave her his card. Told her she had a look. Told her she should think about modeling. Her parents were skeptical. Modeling wasn't a real career. It wasn't stable. It wasn't something you could build a life on. But Isabella was persistent. She went to the photographer's studio with Maria as her chaperone. She did a test shoot. And when the photographer showed her the results, when Isabella saw herself transformed by lighting and angles and the click of a shutter, she knew. This was what she wanted. This was how she would build her something from nothing. For 2 years, she worked with local photographers building her portfolio. Small jobs. Fashion shows at the Aventura Mall. Promotional work for local boutiques. Nothing glamorous, but she was learning. Learning how to move. How to work with a camera. How to present herself as a product. And she was good at it. She had that quality that separates the girls who model from the girls who become models. Presence. Determination. The ability to take direction while still maintaining some essential core of self. In January 2003, Rafael Medina, a photographer who'd been shooting Miami Fashion Week for years, saw Isabella at a casting call and immediately called Victor Castellanos. Rafael had discovered models for Victor before. He knew what Victor looked for. And he knew, the moment he saw Isabella walk into that room, that she was exactly what Victor wanted. Young but not too young. Beautiful but not conventionally so. Striking. Memorable. Someone whose face you couldn't forget even if you wanted to. Victor agreed to see her. This alone was significant. Victor Castellanos didn't meet with every model who walked through his doors. He had agents and bookers for that. But when Rafael said he had someone special, Victor paid attention. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Isabella sat in Victor's office, that legendary space with its white walls and its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the design district, and she talked about her dreams. About wanting to work with great photographers. About wanting to see her face in Vogue. About wanting to walk the runways in New York, Paris, Milan. About wanting to make enough money to buy her parents a house. To prove that her dreams weren't foolish. To prove that beauty could be more than vanity. Victor listened. He studied her. He asked her to stand, to turn, to walk. He looked at her bone structure, her proportions, her movement. And then he said the words that changed everything. He said, "I'll represent you. You'll be with prestige talent. You'll be one of mine." Isabella called Maria from the sidewalk outside the agency, breathless with excitement. She'd been chosen. Victor Castellanos, the man who'd launched the careers of models she'd only dreamed of meeting, had chosen her. Her career was about to begin. Really begin. What Isabella didn't know was that Victor's interest in her wasn't just professional. From that first meeting, Victor had decided something about Isabella Cruz. He'd decided she was perfect. Not just beautiful. Not just talented. Perfect. And Victor had very specific ideas about perfection. About how it should be preserved. About how it should be protected from a world that would inevitably corrupt it, age it, destroy it. The first few months were everything Isabella had hoped for. Victor gave her the best photographers at the agency. He personally oversaw her portfolio development. He got her bookings with designers who usually wouldn't look at a new face. He was building her career with the same obsessive attention to detail he brought to everything. And it was working. By March 2003, Isabella was appearing in local fashion magazines. By April, she was walking in Miami Fashion Week shows. By May, designers from New York were requesting her for their shows. But there was a cost. Victor's attention came with expectations. He controlled her schedule completely. Every booking went through him. Every photographer had to meet his approval. He dictated what she wore to castings, how she styled her hair, even what she ate. He said it was mentorship. He said he was protecting her from the industry's excesses, from the people who would use her and discard her. He said he knew what was best for her career. Isabella's family started to worry. They didn't see her as much. When they did, she seemed tired. Stressed. She talked about Victor constantly. Victor said this. Victor thinks that. Victor wants me to. It was always Victor. When Maria asked if everything was okay, if Victor was treating her well, Isabella insisted everything was fine. This was just how the industry worked. This was the price of success. But in private moments, in conversations with her close friend Carmen Rodriguez, Isabella admitted she felt trapped. She said Victor watched her constantly. That he called her at all hours to check on her. That he seemed jealous whenever other people showed interest in her career. That he talked about her like she was his creation, his achievement, his property. The opportunity that changed everything came in late May. A major designer planning a show during Milan Fashion Week in July requested Isabella specifically. This was the breakthrough moment. Milan was where international careers were made. If Isabella succeeded in Milan, she would no longer be a Miami model. She would be a global name. Victor's response was complicated. Publicly, he celebrated. He told the agency this was what they'd been working toward. He told Isabella this was her moment. But privately, his behavior became more controlling. More possessive. He insisted on managing every detail of the Milan trip personally. He said he would travel with her. Stay in the same hotel. Oversee everything. Isabella tried to push back. She wanted some independence. She wanted to prove she could do this without Victor hovering. She wanted to breathe. They fought about it. According to Lisa Harrington, who was a senior agent at Prestige at the time, she could hear raised voices coming from Victor's office in early June. Isabella's voice saying she needed space. Victor's voice saying she didn't understand how fragile her position was, how easily everything could fall apart without his guidance. The fight ended with Isabella leaving Victor's office in tears. 3 days later, on June 7, 2003, Isabella had a scheduled late meeting with Victor. She told Maria she would come by the family house afterward for dinner. She told Carmen she would call her that night. She walked into Victor's office at 6:47 p.m. Security footage from the building's entrance shows her arriving. She was wearing jeans and a white t-shirt. Her hair was pulled back. She looked tired. She was never seen alive again. When Isabella didn't show up for dinner, Maria called her cell phone. No answer. She called Prestige Talent. The agency was closed for the evening. She left messages. By midnight, she was worried. By morning, she was terrified. She went to Isabella's apartment. The door was locked. She got the building manager to let her in. Isabella's things were there. Her passport was on her dresser. Her clothes were in the closet. There was no sign of packing, no sign of leaving. Just absence. Maria called the police. Filed a missing person report. Detective Sarah Williams was assigned the case. She was thorough. She interviewed everyone at Prestige Talent. She went through Isabella's apartment with forensic teams. She traced her movements on June 7. The trail ended at Victor's office. Isabella went in. She never came out. At least, that's what everyone thought. When Detective Williams questioned Victor, he was cooperative. Concerned. He said Isabella had come to his office upset about the pressure of the Milan trip. They'd talked. He'd tried to reassure her. But she'd seemed overwhelmed. She left around 8 p.m. He'd watched her walk to the elevator. He'd thought she needed time to process everything. He'd planned to check on her the next day. Detective Williams pressed him. Had they argued? Victor admitted there had been tension. Professional disagreements about the Milan booking. Isabella had wanted more independence than Victor thought she was ready for. But it had been a normal conversation, he insisted. Perhaps a bit heated, but nothing unusual for their industry. Nothing that would make her disappear. The security footage confirmed Isabella entering the building at 6:47 p.m. But the footage from the elevator and the exit showed no sign of her leaving. Victor explained that the security system had blind spots. That the footage wasn't comprehensive. That Isabella must have left through a side exit that wasn't monitored. It was plausible. The building was old. The security system wasn't perfect. For 2 days, As police searched and family members posted flyers and friends called every hospital in Miami, Victor said nothing publicly. Then, on June 10, he called a press conference. Cameras from local news stations arrived at Prestige Talent. Fashion journalists gathered in the agency's main room. And Victor, looking grief-stricken and exhausted, made his announcement. He said Isabella had cracked under pressure. That she'd been struggling with anxiety about her career. That her family, in conversations he claimed to have had with them, believed she might have run away. That the demands of international modeling had become too much. That she'd chosen to walk away from everything rather than face the expectations. It was a masterful performance. Victor positioned Isabella's disappearance as a tragedy, yes, but also as a cautionary tale about the industry's brutal demands. He deflected any blame from himself or the agency. He painted himself as a heartbroken mentor who tried his best but couldn't save a young woman from her own inability to handle success. The media accepted this narrative without question. They'd seen it before. The model who couldn't handle the pressure. The girl who cracked. It fit every stereotype they already believed about the fashion industry. And Victor's reputation provided credibility. Why would a man like Victor Castellanos, successful and respected, lie about something like this? Detective Williams wasn't satisfied. Nothing about Isabella's background or behavior suggested someone who would run. No financial troubles. No substance abuse. No history of mental health crises. But she had no evidence to contradict Victor's story. Nobody. No witnesses. No proof of foul play. The case remained open but essentially stalled. Isabella Cruz became another missing person statistic. Another young woman who disappeared and left behind nothing but questions and grief. Maria Cruz refused to believe her sister had run away. She knew Isabella. Knew her determination, her commitment, her love for their family. Isabella wouldn't do that. Wouldn't just vanish without a word. Wouldn't abandon everything she'd worked for. But knowing something and proving something are different things. And as weeks turned into months, as the police investigation yielded nothing, as the media moved on to other stories, Maria was left with nothing but certainty and powerlessness. What no one knew, what no one could have imagined, was that Isabella Cruz hadn't left the building. She was still there. Still in Victor's office. And what Victor did in the hours after she died would remain hidden for 17 years. 1 week after Isabella's disappearance, on June 15, 2003, Victor Castellanos called a special meeting in the gallery. He invited only his most senior and trusted staff. Lisa Harrington, his head booker. Robert Chen, his chief photographer. Margaret Sullivan, his financial manager. People who'd been with him for years. People who understood his vision, his methods, his devotion to the agency. They gathered outside the gallery door, curious and slightly apprehensive. Victor rarely allowed anyone into his private sanctuary. The room was his alone. But today, he said, he wanted to share something important. Something that would honor Isabella's memory. Something that would ensure she was never forgotten. He unlocked the door and led them inside. The room was as it always was. Climate-controlled perfection. Racks of vintage gowns. Soft lighting. But in the center, where there had previously been only empty space, now stood a platform. And on that platform, draped in an elegant gown, was a figure. Lisa Harrington would later describe the moment of seeing it for the first time as both breathtaking and deeply uncomfortable. The figure looked exactly like Isabella. Not similar. Not reminiscent. Exactly like her. Every feature. Every detail. The bone structure. The specific curve of her lips. The way her shoulders held themselves. It was Isabella frozen in time. Victor explained that he'd commissioned the piece months earlier. That he'd wanted to capture Isabella's essence before the fashion world got hold of her, before international fame changed her, before she lost whatever quality made her special. He'd worked with a renowned sculptor, he said, someone who specialized in hyperrealistic figure work. The process had taken months. Measurements. Photographs. Countless sittings. And now, by cruel coincidence, it served as a memorial to a career that never happened. The story was plausible enough. Victor was known for his grand gestures, his obsessive attention to detail. Commissioning a sculpture of a model he believed in wasn't entirely out of character. The timing was strange, certainly. But grief made people do strange things. And the sculpture itself was undeniably extraordinary. A masterwork of realistic art. Victor named it simply Isabella. He said it would remain in the gallery as a permanent tribute. A reminder of potential unfulfilled. A cautionary tale about the industry's demands. And perhaps, he said quietly, a way for him to keep believing she might still come back someday. To have something of her that couldn't leave, couldn't change, couldn't disappoint. The senior staff left the gallery that day with mixed feelings. The sculpture was beautiful but unsettling. The gesture was touching but excessive. But this was Victor. Excessive was his default setting. And if creating this helped him process his grief over losing his star model, if it gave him some way to cope with the failure of not being able to save Isabella from whatever demons had driven her away, then perhaps it was understandable. What none of them knew was that the sculpture hadn't taken months to create. It had been completed in a matter of days. And the process hadn't involved a commissioned artist working from measurements and photographs. It had involved Victor Castellanos working alone in that locked room with skills he'd learned decades ago in Cuba, with techniques he'd studied in secret, with an obsession that had finally found its ultimate expression. Victor Castellanos had immigrated to Miami from Havana in 1980, during the Mariel boat lift. He was 28 years old. He told people he'd worked in fashion in Cuba, that he'd been a stylist and talent scout. This was partially true. But what Victor didn't share was his earlier training. Before fashion, Victor had worked in a medical facility in Havana. He'd been a morgue assistant. He'd learned anatomy, preservation techniques, the processes involved in preparing bodies for burial. He'd been good at it. Precise. Detailed. Unbothered by the work. He'd left that career behind when he came to America. Fashion was more glamorous, more respected, more lucrative. But he'd never forgotten those skills. Never forgotten the satisfaction of working with his hands to create something permanent from something temporary. And over the years, as his career in fashion grew, as he became more powerful and more obsessed with the models he represented, an idea had begun to form in his mind. What if you could preserve beauty? Really preserve it? Not just in photographs that faded or memories that blurred. What if you could stop time? Keep someone perfect forever? It was a thought that grew from idle fascination into genuine research. Victor studied plastination, the process developed by Gunther von Hagens that preserved bodies using polymers. He studied taxidermy techniques. He studied embalming methods used by Victorian mourners who kept their dead in their homes for years. He accumulated knowledge in secret, never telling anyone, never letting on that his interest in preservation went beyond vintage couture. And then Isabella Cruz walked into his office in January 2003, and Victor saw perfection. Young, beautiful, ambitious, and most importantly, his. He would shape her career, control her image, make her into exactly what he wanted her to be. She would be his greatest creation. His legacy. But as the months went on, as Isabella's success grew, Victor realized she was slipping away. She was talking about independence. About working with other agents. About Milan being her chance to break free from his control. She didn't understand that she wasn't supposed to leave. She was his. His discovery. His creation. His perfect thing. The fight on June 7 had been worse than Victor told the police. Isabella had said she was done. That she was grateful for what he'd taught her, but she needed to move forward on her own. That his control was suffocating her. That she couldn't breathe. Victor had tried to reason with her. Tried to explain that she needed him, that without his guidance she would fail, that she was making a terrible mistake. But Isabella had been firm. She was going to Milan. Without him. And when she came back, she was going to find new representation. Victor couldn't allow that. Couldn't let her leave. Couldn't watch his perfect creation walk away and become something else, something he didn't control, something that would age and change and lose everything that made her perfect. If he couldn't have Isabella as his model, as his creation, as his controlled and perfect thing, then he would have her another way. The injection was quick. A sedative combined with a paralytic agent, substances Victor had quietly acquired over the preceding months. Isabella collapsed quickly. There was no struggle. No screaming. No chance for her to understand what was happening. And then, as she lost consciousness, Victor administered the final dose. A cardiac agent that stopped her heart in minutes. He'd planned this carefully. The gallery was soundproofed. The building security system had blind spots he knew well. He worked through the night, using every technique he'd studied, every method he'd researched. The preservation process was complex, requiring precision and patience. Arterial injection of preservative fluids. Replacement of bodily fluids with polymer solutions. Chemical treatment to prevent decomposition. It took hours. By morning, the work was done. Isabella Cruz was preserved. Her body was treated with the same obsessive care Victor applied to his vintage gowns. She would never age now. Never leave. Never disappoint. She would be his forever, exactly as he wanted her. Perfect. Young. Unchanging. Eternally his. Victor dressed her in a gown from his collection. Styled her hair. Applied makeup. Positioned her on a platform he'd had custom-built weeks earlier. She looked like a sculpture. Like art. Like exactly what he would tell everyone she was. And he knew no one would question it. Why would they? He was Victor Castellanos. His word was authority. His vision was unquestionable. For 17 years, his secret was held. The gallery remained locked. Only Victor had full access. Marcus Thompson was allowed once a week to clean, but only under strict conditions. Only with Victor watching or with explicit instructions not to touch anything beyond basic maintenance. The chemical smell that permeated the room was explained away as leather preservation. The figure's unsettling realism was praised as extraordinary artistry. The question of why a man would spend hours alone with a sculpture was dismissed as eccentric genius at work. Fashion journalists wrote about the Isabella sculpture as one of Miami's hidden artistic treasures. Other designers and agents who were granted rare viewing access described it as hauntingly beautiful. Some found it uncomfortable, the realism too intense, the concept too morbid. But being uncomfortable wasn't illegal. Morbid wasn't evidence of crime. It was just Victor being Victor. Isabella's family never stopped searching. Maria Cruz kept her sister's missing person case active. She maintained a website with Isabella's photos, begging anyone with information to come forward. She organized annual vigils on the anniversary of Isabella's disappearance. She never gave up hope that somehow, someday, she would learn what happened to her sister. But the fashion industry moved on quickly. By 2004, there were new models, new faces, new stories. Isabella Cruz became a footnote. A cautionary tale fashion professors would reference in classes about the industry's pressures. A name that came up occasionally in articles about missing models. But mostly, she was forgotten. Except by her family. Except for Victor Castellanos, who spent hours in his gallery, maintaining his collection, adjusting Isabella's clothing with the changing seasons, talking to her about the agency's business, about the models he was currently representing, about how she was still his greatest achievement even if no one else knew it. Marcus Thompson noticed how much time Victor spent in the gallery, especially as Victor got older and more reclusive. Sometimes Marcus would arrive early in the morning and Victor would already be there, having spent the night in that room. Sometimes Marcus would hear Victor's voice through the locked door, talking, as if having a conversation. It was strange. But Victor was strange. The fashion industry was full of eccentric people. Marcus didn't question it. It wasn't his place to question it. And so 17 years passed. 17 years of Isabella's family mourning. 17 years of the fashion industry forgetting. 17 years of Isabella Cruz standing silent and still in a locked room while the world outside changed and moved on and forgot her name. Until March 2020, when COVID-19 killed Victor Castellanos. And August 2020, when Marcus Thompson's hand slipped and a wig shifted and a scar was revealed and the truth came crashing through 17 years of careful deception. The 911 call Marcus Thompson made on that Tuesday afternoon in August 2020 triggered an immediate response. Miami-Dade Police. The Medical Examiner's Office. Crime scene investigators. Within an hour, the building was swarming with officials trying to understand what Marcus had discovered. Dr. James Rivera, the chief medical examiner, was among the first to examine the figure. He approached it with professional skepticism. Marcus Thompson was clearly shaken, clearly convinced he'd discovered something horrific. But was it possible he was wrong? Could this be an extraordinarily realistic sculpture that had simply fooled an untrained eye? Dr. Rivera spent 5 minutes examining the figure before he called for his team to treat the gallery as a crime scene. What Marcus had felt and seen was accurate. This wasn't a sculpture. This wasn't art. These were human remains. Preserved through a process that was clearly sophisticated and clearly intended to arrest decomposition indefinitely. The skin texture was organic. The hair was rooted. The fingernails showed growth patterns that only occur in living tissue. This had been a person. And based on the apparent age of the body and the preservation method, this person had been dead for a significant length of time. The identity confirmation took slightly longer but was ultimately straightforward. Dental records from Isabella Cruz's file, maintained by Detective Sarah Williams who had never closed the missing person case, were a perfect match. Fingerprints, though the skin had been chemically treated, were still recoverable and matched Isabella's prints from her original modeling applications. And that small crescent-shaped scar behind the left ear, the one Marcus had seen, the one that had triggered his realization, appeared in early photographs of Isabella from before she signed with Prestige Talent. This was Isabella Cruz. Missing since June 7, 2003. Reported as a runaway who couldn't handle the pressure of the fashion industry. Mourned by her family. Forgotten by the world. And standing in Victor Castellanos' private gallery for 17 years, dressed in haute couture, displayed like a museum piece, kept as the ultimate expression of one man's twisted obsession. The forensic examination revealed the method of death. A small puncture mark behind the ear, precisely placed, indicated injection of a substance into the carotid artery. Toxicology testing on preserved tissue samples showed traces of multiple pharmaceutical agents. A sedative. A paralytic. A cardiac drug. Victor had killed Isabella quickly and with technical precision, suggesting medical knowledge and premeditation. The preservation process itself was analyzed by forensic experts and yielded a disturbing picture of Victor's capabilities. He'd used a combination of techniques drawn from multiple disciplines. Medical embalming. Plastination. Taxidermy preservation. Chemical treatment methods used in museum specimen preparation. The process would have taken extensive time, specialized equipment, and detailed knowledge. This wasn't something done impulsively. This was something Victor had researched, planned, and prepared for. Records subpoenaed from chemical supply companies showed Victor had been purchasing preservation chemicals, polymer solutions, and specialized equipment since early 2003. Months before Isabella's disappearance. The purchases were made through shell companies and delivered to addresses other than the agency. Victor had been planning this. Preparing for it. Waiting for the moment when Isabella would try to leave him, and he would have to stop her. The gallery itself, when forensically examined, revealed more secrets. Hidden ventilation specifically designed to handle chemical fumes. Specialized lighting that wouldn't degrade organic materials. Climate control settings are far more precise than necessary for vintage clothing. The room had been designed as much for preserving human remains as for protecting couture gowns. Victor had built this space knowing what he would eventually use it for. Further investigation revealed Victor's background. His time working in medical facilities in Cuba. His training in mortuary science. His fascination with preservation techniques. Everything that Victor had carefully hidden from his fashion world colleagues, all the skills and knowledge he deliberately left out of his professional biography, now came to light. Victor Castellanos hadn't just been a fashion mogul with an obsessive streak. He'd been a man with the knowledge and capability to commit an almost perfect crime. The only imperfection had been time. 17 years of maintaining the preservation. 17 years of living with his secret. 17 years of risk that someday, somehow, someone would discover what was hidden in that locked room. But Victor had died believing his secret was safe. That Isabella would remain his forever. That no one would ever know what he'd done. Detective Sarah Williams, now retired but pulled back into the case that had haunted her for 17 years, sat in an interview room and wept when she learned the truth. She'd been in that building. She'd questioned Victor. She'd walked past the gallery's locked door during her initial investigation. Isabella had been there. 20 feet away. And she hadn't known. The failures were systematic. The security footage Victor said had blind spots had actually captured more than he'd admitted, but no one had reviewed it thoroughly enough to notice inconsistencies in his story. The gallery, which Victor claimed was just his private collection space, should have been searched during the missing person investigation, but his reputation had protected him. The deference given to wealth and power had created cover for Victor to literally keep his victim's body on display while pretending to cooperate with police. The media coverage when the story broke was immediate and intense. International news outlets picked up the story of the model whose body had been discovered preserved in her former agent's locked room. Fashion industry figures who'd known Victor, who'd praised his artistic vision, who'd been shown the Isabella sculpture and admired its realism, now had to reckon with what they'd actually been looking at. The conversations about the industry's toxic culture, about the power dynamics that allowed abuse, about the way models were treated as objects rather than people, erupted with renewed intensity. But for Maria Cruz and her family, the media storm was secondary to a simpler truth. Isabella was found. After 17 years of not knowing, of hoping and fearing and searching and praying, they had answers. Terrible answers. Answers that revealed Isabella hadn't abandoned them, hadn't chosen to leave, hadn't cracked under pressure. She'd been murdered by a man she'd trusted. A man who'd promised to make her dreams come true. A man who'd decided that if he couldn't control her career, he would control her body. The grief was overwhelming. Maria had spent 17 years believing her sister might still be alive somewhere. That belief, painful as it was, had allowed for possibility. Now that possibility is gone, replaced with certainty and horror. Isabella had been dead since June 2003. That night she went to Victor's office to tell him she was leaving. Since the moment she tried to claim her independence. Rosa Cruz, Isabella's mother, who had maintained a shrine to her missing daughter in her home, who had never stopped believing Isabella would somehow come home, had to confront the reality that her daughter had never left Miami. Had been minutes away for 17 years. Had been kept like a trophy while Rosa prayed for her safe return. The funeral, held in September 2020, was both an ending and a beginning. Ending because Isabella was finally laid to rest. Her body, released by the medical examiner's office after all forensic work was complete, was buried in a cemetery in Little Havana. The family chose a simple headstone with her name, her dates, and a single line, "Beloved daughter and sister. Forever young. Finally free." Beginning because the family could finally start processing their grief. Not the grief of uncertainty and missing and endless questions. But the grief of loss. Of a life cut short. Of dreams unfulfilled. Of a young woman who deserved so much more than she got. The industry reckoning that followed was incomplete and insufficient, as such reckonings often are. There were panels and discussions about protecting models. There were new protocols and agencies signed agreements about model safety. Florida passed legislation requiring background checks for agency owners and mandatory reporting of concerning behavior. The law was named Isabella's Law, a small monument to a life that had been taken and hidden. But many of the structural issues that had allowed Victor's crime remained. The power imbalances between agents and models. The way young women were still treated as products to be managed rather than people to be protected. The industry's tendency to close ranks and protect its own rather than confront uncomfortable truths. Isabella's case forced conversations, but changing culture takes more than conversation. For Marcus Thompson, the discovery left scars that didn't heal easily. He'd been in that room hundreds of times. Cleaned around Isabella's body hundreds of times. He'd felt uncomfortable, had noticed things didn't seem quite right, but he'd dismissed his instincts. He'd told himself he was imagining things. He'd chosen to look away rather than look closer. That knowledge haunted him. Therapy helped. Understanding that he couldn't have known that Victor's deception was sophisticated and his reputation provided perfect cover, that even trained professionals had failed to see what was hidden, provided some relief from the guilt. But Marcus still sometimes wakes up at night seeing that moment. His hand touches skin instead of silicone. The scar revealed itself. The sudden, horrible understanding that changed everything. The building that housed Prestige Talent Agency was demolished in late 2020. The new owners, who'd purchased it before Isabella's body was discovered, wanted nothing to do with the property's dark history. The gallery was dismantled first, every piece of it destroyed. The rest of the building followed. Where it once stood, there's now a small park. No plaque. No memorial. Just green space and benches where people sit without knowing what was once there. Victor Castellanos' reputation, built over decades, was destroyed in the revelation of a single truth. His name, once synonymous with artistic vision and discovered talent, became synonymous with obsession and murder. The models he'd successfully launched, whose careers he'd legitimately helped build, had to reckon with being associated with a killer. Some spoke publicly about their own experiences with Victor's controlling behavior, patterns they dismissed as industry standard but now understood as precursors to his ultimate crime. The models who'd seen the Isabella sculpture, who'd stood in the gallery and admired what they thought was art, had to process that they'd been looking at a murder victim. That they'd praised Victor's artistic vision while looking at evidence of his crime. The psychological impact of that realization, the understanding that you'd been manipulated into complimenting something so horrific, affected many of them deeply. But perhaps the most important legacy of Isabella's case was what it revealed about how society values young women, particularly young women in industries built on their appearance. Isabella had been missing for 17 years. Her case had gone cold. The fashion industry had moved on. And even after her body was discovered, some of the coverage focused more on Victor's artistic skill and preservation than on Isabella's loss. As if the technical achievement of his crime was somehow more noteworthy than the human life he'd taken. Maria Cruz spent months after the funeral giving interviews, speaking at panels, doing everything she could to keep the focus on Isabella the person. Not Isabella the victim. Not Isabella the cautionary tale. Isabella who loved to dance. Who reads poetry. Who dreamed of using fashion as a way to build something meaningful. Who called her mother every Sunday. Who sent money home even when she barely had enough herself. Who was kind to everyone, even people who couldn't advance her career. Who mattered as more than just a story or a scandal or an example. And slowly, that version of Isabella began to emerge in the public consciousness. Photographs of her alive, laughing, vibrant, began to replace the images of the gallery and the crime scene. Her family shared videos of her dancing at a cousin's wedding, singing off-key in the car, playing with the neighborhood kids. Isabella, who'd been a person, not a possession, started to reclaim her own narrative from the man who'd tried to write her ending. In the years since, the fashion industry has continued its complicated relationship with Isabella Cruz's memory. Some agencies use her case as a teaching moment in their onboarding for new models. Some advocacy organizations invoke her name when pushing for better protections. Some photographers and designers who knew her maintain that she would have been extraordinary, that Victor didn't just take her life but robbed the world of the art she would have created, the doors she would have opened for other Latina models, the impact she would have made. But the most fitting memorial to Isabella Cruz isn't in policy changes or industry panels or news stories. It's in the park where the Prestige Talent Agency once stood. It's not marked or announced, but Maria Cruz goes there sometimes. Sits on a bench. Talks to her sister. Tells her about the family. About the nieces and nephews Isabella never got to meet. About their mother's garden. About everything Isabella missed. And sometimes, other people sit there too. People who knew Isabella. People who heard her story. People who never met her but understand what she represents. They sit in the sun, in the space where Isabella was kept in darkness for 17 years, and they remember. Not the horror of how she died or how she was kept. But the brightness of how she lived. The dreams she had. The person she was before someone decided she was his to keep. This is the story of Isabella Cruz. A young woman whose beauty was supposed to be her pathway to freedom but instead became her cage. A sister, a daughter, a friend whose absence created a wound that never healed. A victim whose body was displayed as art while her family searched for her everywhere except where she actually was. But more than that, this is a reminder. That beneath every perfect image, every polished presentation, every manufactured moment of beauty, there is a human being. Someone with a family. With dreams. With a right to autonomy, to safety, to a future that's theirs to choose. Isabella Cruz had that right. And Victor Castellanos took it from her because he believed his desires mattered more than her humanity. Justice for Isabella came 17 years later. She never got to walk in Milan. Never got to buy her parents that house. Never got to become the person she was working so hard to be. But her story, as painful as it is, as horrific as its details are, serves as a testament to the importance of looking closer. Of questioning narratives that seem too convenient. Of refusing to let power and reputation shield people from accountability. Of remembering that missing people are always more than just cases or statistics or stories. They're someone's Isabella. And they deserve to be found. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve justice, no matter how long it takes. If you found value in this investigation, if you believe stories like Isabella's need to be told and remembered, please subscribe to this channel. Share this video. Help ensure that Isabella Cruz's name is remembered not just as a cautionary tale, but as a person who mattered. Hit that like button. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. And most importantly, if you know someone who's missing, if you're worried about someone's safety, if something doesn't feel right, trust your instincts. Don't dismiss your concerns. Don't assume someone else will ask the questions that need to be asked. Thank you for listening to Isabella's story. For bearing witness to what happened to her. For helping ensure that she's remembered as more than just a true crime case, but as a young woman whose life mattered and whose loss still echoes in the people who loved her. Rest in peace, Isabella Maria Cruz. You were never his. You always belonged to yourself and to the people who truly loved you. And now, finally, you're free.